Hello again. I hope you're well, and you had a good New Year's and Christmas if you celebrate that. If you don't, just a holiday. I think this is episode 15. I'm not going to check. I'm just going to guess it's 15. And in this episode, I speak to a gentleman called Michael Darling, who is a museum curator and has worked through a handful of different museums, with his most recent tenure being at the Chicago Contemporary Museum of Art. He's done a lot of different exhibitions, people like Kurt Cobain, David Bowie, Riot Girls, and most recently an exhibition with the late designer Virgil Abloh. So I originally approached Michael to discuss his work with Virgil Abloh, and I decided to turn it into a full podcast. So what you'll hear is we'll reference the fact that we spoke about Virgil Abloh at some point, but I've actually cut out the bit where we do actually speak about him because I'm going to use that for something else at a later date, which I'm hoping to do. So it's sort of referenced, but you won't hear it at any point, and I'll jump over it. So if it kind of sounds a bit weird, that's why. But that'll come out at a later date, hopefully. I'm not 100% sure when. It might be a bit longer than what I usually do. It's kind of more like almost like a documentary of sorts I want to do. But yeah, that'll be out at some point. But yeah, I hope you enjoy. So yeah, for the people listening at home that maybe don't have the pleasure of knowing yourself, could you maybe give them a bit of a brief introduction as to who you are and what you do?
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me, Brian? Is that working?
Yeah,
Okay.
you're all good. Yeah.
My name is Michael Darling, and I currently am the Chief Growth Officer at a little startup company called Museum Exchange, which is devoted to helping to smooth the pathway for art collectors who might want to donate artworks to museums, primarily in the US and Canada. And before that, I had a long career as a curator in art museums, most recently as chief curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago. But before that, also at the Seattle Art Museum and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. And I would say, I've just always been very involved with contemporary art, but also dabble on the side with design in various forms, whether architecture, furniture design, or in the topic we're talking about today, the Virgil Abloh exhibition I curated at the MCA Chicago was really my first exhibition, I would say, that kind of veered into fashion design.
I guess I was going to ask it a little bit later. So, obviously, your career has been in curation for the most part, but as you said, you do stuff on the side. Is there so from the start? Was there sort of a discipline that you had sort of an eye on before you got into sort of art history?
Well, I did, I did my undergraduate degree in art history, and I was always very interested in contemporary art and what artists were making now, at that time. But when I was in doing those studies, there really weren't very many professors that were teaching contemporary art, so I really had to kind of learn it on my own. And so a lot of that meant going to galleries. I started writing art criticism for some newspapers and magazines in California. And even by the time I ended up pursuing a master's degree in art history that focused more on photography. And then I ended up doing a PhD that ended up being in architecture and design. So, but then always keeping my fingers in the pie of contemporary art stuff and writing and curating on the side. So I guess I really found that the job opportunities maybe were more plentiful in contemporary art than they were for architecture and design. I mean, there were very few curators of contemporary art in any given city, but there are even fewer curators of architecture or design, just because not all museums really cover those disciplines. So as things played out, my career prospects were looking better and panning out more in contemporary art than they really were with architecture and design things, even though I remained, interested in that.
So yeah, I guess jumping backwards a bit, when I was doing research on yourself, I think you're probably the person where it's come up with the most for some reason. So I had a lot to go from, but I found this article. I think it was from 2015. You might know what I'm talking about. I think it was a talk. It was a talk. It was for your it would be for your college, and you were talking about your career since you graduated and what it was like working there and things like that. So that was kind of, there was a lot in that which I just pulled from slow. So that's where a lot of it comes from. But in that article, it talks about when you were in school, you found this book that was on it had Picasso and Kandinsky in, and that was sort of an epiphany moment for you, and then it kind of locked things into place. So would it be safe to say sort of that you've had an interest in the arts from kind of a young age?
Yes, yeah, that is true. That probably dates back to, when I was 13 or 14 years old, when I kind of had an art class in, the American middle school. I don't know what the equivalent would be in the UK. And I just got really excited, like, who are these guys? What is this? And from that point, I had just sort of nurtured an interest in that, and but never really knew how to turn that into a career or anything. In fact, when I first went to university, I was really studying. I thought I was going to study like economics and go into some kind of like finance or business, but I just was doing much better in the art history classes, and enjoyed those much more. And so I shifted my focus.
So yeah, as you kind of touched on what it says in the article, and it says online, you studied art history from there up to kind of a PhD level and things like that. But some of your earliest work, so you had a plethora of jobs from what I understand. You worked as an gallery art guard at a certain point, but some of your first work was an art critic, which you touched on earlier. Do you think that those sort of that handful of jobs that you had at the beginning sort of shaped what you do now and what you've been doing for the majority of your career?
Yeah, I really do. When I was working as a museum security guard, it gave me kind of a real insight into how people behave in art museums, and also, the other guards that I worked with were all really accomplished people in their own right, and so I also kind of got a sense of how the kind of elitism that could operate in the art world and in museums in particular, where the fancy people in the offices that deal with all the rich people, kind of might think that these guards that are working downstairs, don't really have and like that maybe it's not a prestigious job or something, but a lot of those folks are working artists, musicians, visual artists, all kinds of things. And so it really gave me an appreciation for the people at all levels within an art museum. And I've really tried to kind of hang on to that throughout my career, and really show respect and care for people all up and down the hierarchy in museums. And then also, working as an art critic for sure really helped me hone my writing skills that I would go on to use all the way up to this day. And in fact, even the other day I was kind of talking with a friend about an early editor that I had, and just like, every time he would call me, it would be almost painful, because he said, Michael, this article, I don't know, really needs some work. Like, he really would ride me and really force me to write more clearly. And so I think those jobs, writing criticism in particular, really, I think they kind of helped kind of dispel any kind of writer's block that I might have, because I was writing on deadline all the time. So I just had to get it done. I couldn't sort of sit there and wring my hands and say, oh, I'm not ready to write today. I just had to do it. And so I think that really prepared me to be more fluid about my writing, and also to bring a certain kind of critical eye to it, that still, like I said, serves me to this day.
Jumping kind of off of the back of that, on that article that I mentioned earlier, it mentions that while you were doing your critic writing, that you got a couple of hate mail come through. Is that off of a specific artist, or is that something that happened on a regular basis? Or
Yeah, it did happen fairly regularly. I was when I was writing, I first wrote for a little art magazine that circulated in California that was called, what was it called? Yeah, now I'm blanking on what it was called, but it wasn't art. It was definitely not art news, because that's a bigger magazine. Maybe I'll remember it later, but it was a little magazine that was kind of a newsprint, and would circulate around. And I started writing for them, and then I started writing for the weekly newspaper in Santa Barbara, California, where I was going to graduate school, and then eventually started writing for their daily newspaper there in Santa Barbara, and then I've also started picking up jobs writing for the L.A. Reader, which was a weekly paper in Los Angeles that then eventually became the L.A. Weekly. And I just kind of prided myself at that time on being critical and not holding back. And if there was something that I thought was not, was kind of not rigorous enough, or perhaps putting forward kind of some kind of sloppy vision for where I thought art should go, I was calling it out. And maybe even in that small little community of Santa Barbara, I could have been a little more delicate about my opinions, but I just was kind of letting them rip in these different newspapers. And so there was one artist in Santa Barbara, the local guy, that I offended by one of my reviews, and he posted these posters all around town of like a figure that was bending in almost like a pretzel, where the head was kind of going up the arse of this figure, and that said Michael Darling is a terrible art critic or something to that effect. And then there's another guy that I gave a pretty negative review to in Los Angeles, and one time I ran into him at an art opening, and he was just like standing in front of me and seething and saying that he wanted to punch me in the face right there and stuff. So, and I would say that it often created a kind of a fairly charged, because I was writing, pretty just fearlessly, I suppose. Sometimes walking into galleries or into art exhibitions with that kind of reputation, it did kind of create an atmosphere where you weren't always totally welcome, or people kind of were a bit on guard. And so that was not something that I maybe necessarily like that much, but I definitely sensed that. And it's a much different kind of welcome than you would get if you were working as a museum curator, where people are often trying to kind of curry favor with you and are usually welcomed with pretty open arms. So that was an early experience that I haven't really had to think about in a long time, I guess.
So yeah, obviously since then you've worked, as you mentioned, as a museum curator for a number of different museums, and you've got a vast array of work which spans from Riot Girls to David Bowie and things like that. And I understand this is kind of an inherently flawed question, because every exhibition is different, and each of them has their positive, their negatives, and things like that. But if I had you locked in a room, tied up, and I was like, give me your favorite out of all of them, which one do you think would jump to mind?
Wow, yeah. I mean, I think the work that I've done recently at the Museum of Contemporary at Chicago has been quite gratifying, I would say. And a lot of that, I think, came from the audiences that were coming in to see some of the exhibitions. And I think the Virgil Abloh exhibition and the Takashi Murakami exhibition in particular were ones where really young audiences were coming to those exhibitions. Incredibly ethnically diverse audiences were coming to those exhibitions, and I really felt that people were engaging in the work in a way that just felt very authentic and natural. And to me, it really kind of felt like the museum positioned itself as a really core component of civic life in those situations. And one other experience that maybe kind of came close to that was when I curated a show about Kurt Cobain when I was in Seattle, and there was a similar kind of thing where it's not just art experts or people that really know a lot about art that were coming in to see that exhibition. It was people that were drawn in by the story of Kurt Cobain, by his music perhaps, and kind of coming at art from kind of a side angle. And I think reaching those non-expert audiences was something that I really enjoyed. And again, it kind of helped me kind of come up with a picture in my mind of a museum that again is kind of for the people, and not just for a really educated elite that knows a lot about art already before they walk in the doors. And so I just felt like that was exciting for me and very fulfilling, I would say.
In the process of researching yourself, I kind of ended up finding out what a museum curator was, because I didn't really know what it was beforehand. It was kind of a job that I didn't even know really existed that much. But again, as I said in the other one, it's kind of a bit of a flawed question, because I would presume that, as you said, kind of developing the one for Kurt Cobain, the exhibition now would be completely different to the one that you did with Virgil Abloh, for example. But what's the process to go from sort of start to finish when you're creating an exhibition, and what does a creator actually, what does a role, what's the role that the creator kind of has in all of that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And look, Virgil and Kurt Cobain are two kind of interesting examples because I probably would never have thought that I needed to do a Kurt Cobain show when I was in Seattle. I mean, in Chicago, but in Seattle, a Kurt Cobain show kind of, there was a certain logic to that because he lived there and died there, and the kind of, that's where Nirvana was founded and all of that. And so and likewise, Virgil Abloh was born in Chicago and continued to live in Chicago up until his recent death. So the very, very beginning of an idea for me kind of is about looking at kind of what the city needs, or what the audience kind of needs, and what I think could bring them into the museum and have them engage with the museum. So it's coming up with a topic that feels relevant and lively, and in my case, kind of perhaps opens a door wide for a wider audience than just a very specialized audience, sort of like I said before. So it's kind of coming up with that idea, and then making sure that the rest of the powers that be at the museum support the idea. And then it becomes going out there and kind of looking for the objects that would then fill the museum and activate the gallery spaces of the museum. So you are in some ways working a little bit like an architect. You're in some ways working a little bit like an interior designer to make sure that things look good and feel good and occupy space in a dynamic way. And then behind that is to have some kind of a historical or critical lens that you're bringing to it, and kind of putting your subject in historical context or in a contemporary context, and being able to tell a story to the audiences that are going to come in the door. And so some of that story is told by the objects that are on the wall or in the space, but then a lot of the story also is told by the texts that you have, the labels next to the pieces, the explanatory texts. So the curator's job is really to kind of come up with all of that whole big picture of what this could look like. And then, of course, oftentimes sort of being the project manager that then delegates certain tasks to other staff members in the museum and kind of pulls it all together. And it, oftentimes as well, if you're working with a living artist, it's really being the liaison between that artist and the museum, fielding their interests and questions and sensitivities, really, and making sure that you're showing their art in a way that is respectful to their vision. And there's a lot of ego involved in that, because, when the things that artists make in many ways are not just reflections of them, but they are them kind of manifested in some kind of physical form. So you really have to treat that material very, very carefully and with a lot of respect, and you have to kind of win the respect of the artist in that situation. So there's a lot of I would say kind of cultivation and it's kind of similar maybe to a doctor developing kind of a bedside manner of kind of knowing, building trust, and making sure that the artist knows that you have their best interest in mind as you're also navigating the interests of the museum. So, and then oftentimes nowadays, especially, and maybe more so in the US than in the UK, the curators really need to help tell that story to people that will help fund the exhibition, because in the US especially, we don't have very much government funding for museums and exhibitions, so a lot of that funding comes from private individuals. So oftentimes it's going out to people and talking to them and trying to get them to become involved by writing a check to support that exhibition. So it's a pretty multi-part kind of job, I would say, and not everybody does all of those parts well, but the trick is to try to do all of those as well as possible. So that's basically what I've been doing for the last 25 years or so.
But on the back of that, you mentioned kind of working with dead artists, and it's a bit of a morbid question, but is it easier to work with somebody that's dead in a sense then, because all of that kind of the ego is it just doesn't exist?
Yeah. It is true. It's easier to work with dead artists. But I would say it's often, at least for me, not as rewarding, because when you're having that dialogue with that artist and getting their firsthand firsthand kind of a knowledge of why they made that and how they made that. That is for me really, really exciting. And sometimes dead artists too, they might have estates or foundations or widows or widowers that can maybe also create boundaries and blockades that make it difficult to pull off a project. They might have a specific idea in mind of how that artist they want them to be viewed in perpetuity. And that might be a very restrictive vision. And so oftentimes they can get in the way of important scholarship or visibility and other things. So doesn't always mean that it's going to be an easier road. There could be other people involved that might be more difficult than if the artist himself or herself were still alive.
Yeah, and I guess in a sense, and you just correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but I guess if once an artist's dead, their work is kind of it's done, it's finalized. But I guess with a living artist, by sort of creating it in a museum, it sort of adds more to the narrative, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think what the curator is doing in that situation is really trying to set up a narrative for the legacy of that artist and what they mean to culture, to society, and really create one building block in their legacy, which would be a museum exhibition that kind of helps to cement a career or marks a time in their career and looking at it from whatever, depending on what the focus of the exhibition is. But those are important things, and establishing an artist's importance, I think, or their relevance. And so I guess that's sort of what attracted me to it, because it feels like you're helping to write history while it's being made. And that's why I was always attracted to art criticism too, because you're really on the front lines of writing a history that will be known kind of further down the line.
Yeah, so I guess jumping forward again, this is something that I haven't done before, but I'm hoping to do kind of on the back of this. And I think going forward, I've thought about it since I've sent you the email, and I think I'm going to cut it down to one. But I did say up to three in the email, so that's fine if you've got more than one. But it's just the idea of if you had 30 seconds to talk to a student, and you can give them one. You could tell them, and they will go away from the conversation and look up whatever you tell them to look up, be it a person, a painting, a song, a movie, a TV show, whatever. What would you tell them to go and look up? Something that's kind of been pivotal to your own career.
Wow. Let's see. Yeah, those kind of questions, like what's your favorite album or your favorite movie, are always really hard ones for me to just kind of, because I'm such a magpie, I think, kind of always kind of flitting around from one thing to another. But what is something kind of seminal in that way for me that I think people should know about? Shoot, I don't know. Can we return to that one later? I can think about it.
Yeah, you can do. What's really strange, by the way, I'll come back to it at the end. What's really strange is I spoke to, do you know Ben Khaled, the designer of the Hacienda, the nightclub? I did an interview with him, and obviously he did some work with Virgil as well. When I asked him the same question, which I'm going to ask you a little bit later, which was just a sense of what was it like to work with him, and he described him as a magpie, really weirdly as well, which is kind of weird. Kind of beginning to finish up now, but as you mentioned at the top, you recently left your position at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago as the curator to kind of co-found your new company, Museum Exchange. Was that a difficult decision to take, given the fact you'd been there for quite a long time? You had this. I assume you were kind of rooted down inside of there, and can you give people a rundown at what you do at your new venture as well?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it was not a difficult decision. I was at the MCA Chicago for about 10 and a half years by the time I left early last year. And that's a long time for a museum curator. I think in the US, at least, the kind of average time that a curator stays at a museum is about 4 years. So I felt like I really was able to accomplish a lot here and was ready for a new challenge in a way. And also it came upon at a time too where, as in the UK, there's a lot of kind of social, cultural reckoning within the US, and especially within museums, and especially in terms of having more diverse voices represented. And I just felt like it was time for me as a middle-aged white guy to kind of step aside and have other leaders kind of step into that position, and for a new voices to come. It didn't feel feel right to just sort of stick around too long and just sort of hold on to that position in a way. And so that was one factor for sure. And then again, just sort of me being there 10 years and kind of needing and wanting new challenges was part of that as well. So both of those made it very easy for me when this opportunity for museum exchange came along, and it came to me as a kind of an early concept that then I was able to step in and help build over the course of the last year. But basically, it's kind of like a matchmaking service almost for art collectors who have art that they're ready to give away. Maybe they have chosen not to sell it, or maybe they weren't able to sell it in some way, and giving it to a museum would give that art object a new life. And in the U.S., there also are some tax advantages for people to donate artworks to museums. And so on the one side, I kind of gather together these collectors that have art that they're ready to donate, which now also includes artists, estates that have work and their main mission is to get that art out into the world, into museums. Commercial art galleries are also coming to us and working with us. And then on the other hand, finding museums that are interested in receiving those objects. So on the one side, we have right now 120 museums that are signed on to our program. And every 3 months, they see a new catalog of objects that are all available for donation. And if they want those, they write a proposal, and then the donor gets to decide which museum makes the best case for that piece. And then we put them together. So it's fairly simple concept, and it seems to be really working. Like I said, in less than a year, we've already got 120 museums in the U.S. and Canada signed on and using it, and we've transacted probably close to 200 gifts or something already in this last year. So it's really fun. I get to be, again, kind of this intermediary between the collectors and the museums. And one of the most rewarding parts is being able to kind of get to know all these museums across the country that I hadn't had any dealings with in the past, many of which are in small communities but doing great work and have great collections. So that's been something that's been really a lot of fun for me.
And then, just to kind of round up with the last question, it's a bit cliche in a sense, but if you could give one piece of advice to yourself back in time when you first got started, what would that be?
I think it would maybe be, some of the for me, the biggest sort of career breakthroughs have always happened when I went outside of my comfort zone, which is maybe to be a little bit more of a shy person, and to go out, to reach out directly to people who I think are doing exciting work, and introduce yourself to them, make them aware of what you're doing or your aspirations, and try to break into their field just by kind of approaching them. So like not being afraid to reach out to your heroes, I guess would be another way of saying it, because there's nothing to lose. And oftentimes, you might be the only person that's reached out to them, and they might feel very humbled and kind of honored that you showed an interest in their work. So I think kind of doing that, kind of, again, just being bold and taking a risk and reaching out to someone that's doing important work, or that work that you think is important, I think can often lead to some great opportunities. I should have done that more when I was younger.
And then lastly, of course, I nearly forgot, but leading back to the question about one piece of media,
Yes,
have you thought of
I've got
anything?
an answer for you. Yeah, I do. So, like you mentioned earlier, I really had an amazing privilege to work on the Chicago presentation of the David Bowie exhibition that the Victoria and Albert Museum in London organized, and it was the first American venue for that exhibition. And there was one of the last rooms in that exhibition had a bunch of incredible costumes that Bowie wore. And some of the soundtrack that was playing in that room was from a concert that he did in 1972 at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium in California. And every time I would walk in that room, I would get chills just by the music. And so that I would recommend people to go look at that album. And you can find it on different streaming services, but it's David Bowie live in 1972 in Santa Monica. And I was listening to it again the other day, and I was shocked at how advanced the music felt. Like for 1972, there's a lot of songs that feel like full on punk rock, and 72 just feels very early to be doing punk rock at that time. Not to mention the kind of more kind of glam rock that he was involved in at that time, which feels more on point in terms of the time period. But it's just an incredible album. It has amazing energy. And I used to live in Santa Monica, and so kind of knowing that took place there kind of has special significance for me. But it feels incredibly fresh. So I'd recommend people go out and listen to that album.
And then the very, very last question, I've said that about 4 times now, but where can people find you online if they want to look up you more, I guess?
Yeah, I have a modest presence online through Instagram, I guess, and my handle there is mdubdarling, mdub darling, and my Instagramming usually kind of revolves a lot around travel. And during COVID, I haven't been traveling that much, so it's been a little bit quiet. And another thing that I used to like to post a lot about would be live concerts, and obviously those aren't so easy to go to these days either, are a little bit risky. So it's a bit quiet, maybe not exactly kind of what I would want it to be, but that's maybe where people could get the best sense of what I'm doing outside of work, or also maybe as I'm doing my work too. So.
Hello again. I hope you enjoyed that. As I said at the start, there'll be sort of a chunk of this which is missing, and will come out at a later date with a different project. So keep your eyes, I suppose your ears peeled for that. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed again. If you want to follow me online, I'm party material everywhere. I have a book now out on Amazon if you want to order that. If you want to look at stuff that I do outside of this, called Grand Theft Posters. So it's just like Grand Theft Auto, but posters instead of the auto, obviously. But you have to put book after you type the title in on Amazon for some reason, because if you search just for Grand Theft Posters, it comes up with Grand Theft Auto merchandise as opposed to the book. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I shall see you next time.